So Hillary Clinton is doing a media tour after Russia invaded Ukraine, and she brings up an idea here that is absolutely deranged. It's her strategy to fight back against Russia. Let's watch.
But remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan back in 1980. And although no country went in, they certainly had a lot of countries supplying arms and advice and even some advisors to those who were recruited to fight Russia. It didn't end well for the Russians. There were other unintended consequences, as we know. But the fact is that a very motivated and then funded and armed insurgency basically drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Obviously, the similarities are not ones that you should bank on, because the terrain, the development in urban areas, et cetera, is so different. But I think that is the model that people are now looking toward.
So she wants to copy the strategy that we did in Afghanistan when Russia was waging a war against Afghanistan. That strategy was arming and funding and propping up the Mujahideen, which would later become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which would give us Osama bin Laden, who then did terror attacks against the United States. She's saying we should do that same thing in Russia, or excuse me, in Ukraine. Now, what's the problem with that? Some people might say, well, that's okay. There's no extremist elements like the Mujahideen in Ukraine. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is, as we just discussed, the Azov Battalion, they are a neo-Nazi militia that officially contracts with the National Guard of Ukraine. They are part of the government of Ukraine, and they are open, card-carrying neo-Nazis. They even use Nazi insignia. You know, they use their symbols and whatnot. So look, if we take her logic to its conclusion, it's like, hey, just throw all the money you can and all the weapons you can at Ukraine. No reason to vet or be specific or careful in what we're doing here, because we got to beat the aggressor here, the aggressor being Russia. And that's true, by the way. The aggressor is Russia. Well, that could have some negative consequences, man. Look, here's a scenario how it could go wrong. So you indiscriminately arm Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government. The Azov Battalion, since they're strong men, they are probably the most experienced fighters, having been fighting in the Donbass region for a long time now. And then they become a more powerful faction. And then if Russia gets defeated, or if it's dragged out for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in terms of the war there, eventually, when there's some sort of a settlement, the neo-Nazis come to power in Ukraine. They do their own coup against the democratically elected government, and then you have a neo-Nazi Western satellite state in Ukraine. That is a nightmare scenario. That's a terrible scenario. And she says, well, there were some unintended consequences. What were those unintended consequences? What were they, Hillary? What were the unintended consequences? Oops, we funded Al-Qaeda to the teeth, and Osama bin Laden then turned around and did 9/11 against us. What consequences could this have? I doubt that Ukrainian neo-Nazis would do a terror attack against the U.S., but I don't doubt that a Ukrainian neo-Nazi regime would viciously repress the minorities in Ukraine, whether they be ethnic Russians or gay people or whatever. Now, by the way, let's also be clear that it was the neo-Nazis right now are fighting Chechens, who are Russian. They're like Russian Muslims. And one of the Chechen generals who was just killed was known for his massacring of the LGBT community. So really nothing good here. There's nothing good to talk about. There's only horrible actions on top of horrible actions, countered by horrible actions. But this strategy that she's talking about is psychotic. And also, she seems to think that anything the U.S. does is not in escalation with Russia. Well, obviously there are things we could do that are in escalation. She was out there calling for cyber attacks against Russia the other day. Well, look, okay, maybe there's an argument for that, but keep it real. If we start doing that against them, it's not like they don't have the capability to do cyber attacks against us. What if the internet in the U.S. goes out for a week or some shit? Is that a price you're willing to pay? You have to think about these things rationally. You can't just be Russia bad, Ukraine good, so therefore we do anything and it's okay. That has unintended consequences that are devastating. Last thing I want is a neo-Nazi satellite state in Ukraine. I mean, that'd be horrendous. I would much rather us completely stay out of the fight and let whatever is going to happen than us actively get involved, accidentally fund the Azov battalion enough to the point where they could overthrow a Ukrainian government, even if the Ukrainian government defeats the Russians. I don't want to see that. Do you guys want to see that? I definitely don't. So, look, that is a scenario that could unfold. If we take Hillary's approach, if we just throw all the money and all the weapons in the world at the Ukrainian government, the Azov battalion is part of the Ukrainian National Guard. They admit that up to 20% of the people, are Nazis in their group. I think it's probably more than that since they use the Nazi symbols and whatnot. Some people might be in the closet. Other ones might not be in the closet as Nazis. But I could easily see a situation where we fund them, prop them up, and then they do a coup of a Ukrainian government, even if Ukraine manages to beat back Russia. Not good, man. Not good. Not good at all. So, and none of what I'm saying here should be misconstrued as like a defense of Russia's imperialism. Because Vladimir Putin, in his own words, gave a blood and soil speech, and this was not just about NATO. This was also about his imperial ambitions. Oh, would you look at that? In 2012, Ukraine discovered massive amounts of natural gas, a lot of it, by the way, just off the coast of Crimea. And then, oh, wow, a couple of years after they find it, Vladimir Putin steals Crimea. He's like, this is ours now. Weird. They just found the natural gas there, and then you stole it. And then, by the way, they also found gas in the eastern portion and the western portion. And oh, would you look at that? Vladimir Putin just invaded all of Ukraine. I think a lot of it has to do with the natural gas. So this is, in a way, this is like, there's that connection between Bush's war in Iraq. A lot of it was for the oil, and Putin's war in Ukraine. I think a lot of it's for the natural gas. It's a petro state, effectively. So this isn't to dismiss Putin's imperialism. That matters quite a bit. But that doesn't mean that in response to that, we could be so idiotic that we prop up neo-Nazis who then eventually take over the entire Ukrainian government. For the love of God, any funding or arming that we do of the Ukrainian government needs to not go to the Azov battalion. I would demand that in order for you guys to get any of these weapons, you have to purge the Azov battalion from your ranks. And I have no problem arming Ukrainians who are not neo-Nazis. Like, they are under direct attack and they have a right to self-defense. But you can't give it to the neo-Nazis. You just can't do it. You got to purge them from the ranks, but that's not going to happen. So anyway, Hillary with another horrendous idea. She wants to use the Mujahideen strategy to fight Russia. By the way, didn't really work that well in Afghanistan either. Russia left because they basically had to leave because their empire was crumbling. I mean, you could say, sure, they were fought off by a guerrilla war. Yeah, true, but I still would rather have not armed the Mujahideen in retrospect. They probably would have withdrawn anyway, and we didn't need to arm people who were outright terrorists in the same way that we shouldn't do that now with neo-Nazis. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal Kyle and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.